Chapter 1. The Bloody Road Across the Prairies. Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the American frontier. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time when you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1871. The Civil War had ended just 6 years earlier, leaving a nation still bleeding from its wounds. But in the remote prairies of southeastern Kansas, a different kind of horror was beginning to unfold. This is not a tale of battlefield heroics. This is about darkness that festered in isolation, away from civilized eyes. What follows is reconstructed from courthouse archives, newspaper clippings from the Emporia News and Wichita City Eagle, and eyewitness testimonies that survived the passage of time. Kansas in the early 1870s was a wilderness. The Homestead Act had brought thousands westward, each chasing 160 acres of free land. But communities were sparse, separated by vast stretches of prairie where a man could ride for days without seeing another soul. The Osage Mission Trail cut through this emptiness like a scar, connecting scattered settlements. Along this desolate road, every homestead offering food and shelter was a godsend. Or so it seemed. Imagine yourself as a traveler on that trail. You've been riding for days across the endless prairie. Your supplies are low. Your horse is exhausted. Then you see it. A small cabin rising from the grassland. Smoke curling from its chimney. The relief that washes over you is indescribable. You don't know it yet, but newspapers will later call this place Devil's Kitchen and Hell's Half Acre. The Bender family arrived in 1870, claiming their 160 acres about 8 miles northeast of Cherryvale, positioned strategically along the Osage Mission Trail where desperate travelers would pass. 4 members composed the family. John Bender Sr., a gruff German man with limited English, his wife Elvira, equally taciturn, her eyes holding secrets, never spoken, John Bender Jr., and Kate. Kate was different. Attractive by frontier standards, young, charismatic. She advertised herself as a spiritualist and healer, claiming she could communicate with the dead. In an era when spiritualism swept America, her claims attracted visitors seeking answers from beyond the grave. The homestead itself was modest, a small cabin, roughly 16 by 20 feet, divided by a canvas curtain hanging from ceiling to floor. This curtain separated the living quarters from the dining area where travelers would sit for meals. On one side, guests. On the other side, the family's private space, hidden from view. The cabin housed a small general store selling supplies, ammunition, tobacco. The Benders presented themselves as hard-working homesteaders serving travelers. Why would anyone suspect otherwise? The frontier was full of such families. But beneath this normalcy, something sinister took root. Let me tell you about George Launcher. In the winter of 1872, he left Independence with his 8-year-old daughter Mary Ann, heading to Iowa to start a new life. They never arrived. His former neighbor, Dr. William Henry York, decided to search for them in March 1873. The good doctor questioned homesteaders along the trail, gathering information. On March 9th, he began his return journey to Independence. He never made it home. Dr. York wasn't just anyone. His brother, Colonel Alexander M. York, was a Civil War veteran, lawyer, and Kansas state senator. When William disappeared, the colonel assembled a company of 50 men and began questioning every traveler and visiting every homestead along the trail. On March 28, 1873, Colonel York arrived at the Bender Inn. He asked if they'd seen his brother. The Benders admitted Dr. York had stayed with them. Perhaps, they suggested, he'd run into trouble with Indians. Colonel York agreed this was possible. He stayed for dinner. Think about that. He sat at their table, ate their food, while beneath the floorboards lay the answer to his question. The mechanism of their operation was diabolically simple. When a traveler arrived, Kate would greet them warmly, her charm putting them at ease. They'd be invited to sit at the table for a meal. But the seating wasn't random. The guest would be positioned with their back to the canvas curtain, facing the wall where spiritualist posters hung. They'd be served food. Kate would engage them in pleasant conversation. The traveler would relax, grateful for warmth and hospitality. Behind that curtain, one of the Benders waited, hammer in hand. The blow came suddenly, striking the base of the skull with crushing force. The victim would collapse, dead or dying. Their body would be pulled through the curtain into the private area. Beneath the cabin floor was a cellar, accessed by a trapdoor. The bodies would be dropped there. Their throats would be cut to ensure death and drain the blood. Every valuable would be systematically removed. Money, jewelry, watches, everything. But bodies couldn't stay in the cellar. Eventually, someone would notice. So, under cover of darkness, the corpses would be carried to the orchard behind the cabin. There, in the turned soil where apple trees grew, the victims would be buried in shallow graves. Then, as the sun rose, the Benders would return to their routine. The curtain would be cleaned, the trapdoor closed, the table set for the next traveler. Kate would resume advertising as a spiritualist, claiming to communicate with the dead. The dead she had helped create. The months became years. How many stopped at the Bender Inn? How many continued safely on their journey? And how many never left at all? The numbers remain uncertain, but estimates suggest at least 11 confirmed victims, possibly as many as 20. Each was someone's son, father, brother. Among the dead were men traveling alone, easier targets who wouldn't be missed immediately. But there were also families, including children. George Launcher's 8-year-old daughter, Mary Ann, would later be found in that orchard. Her skull was intact, but she had a broken arm and a scarf tied tightly around her neck. The evidence suggested something more horrifying than murder. She had been buried alive, placed in the grave alongside her murdered father while still breathing. The hardscrabble pioneers who discovered her body, men who had seen the brutality of the Civil War and the harshness of frontier life, were horrified beyond words. But in 1872, as the second year of operations drew to a close, no one knew any of this yet. People went missing on the frontier all the time. They fell victim to accidents, disease, misfortune. Death was an accepted part of frontier life. The Benders continued their work, hidden in plain sight, protected by the vastness of Kansas and the isolation that made their homestead both attractive and deadly. The wind blew across the grasslands. The Osage Mission Trail continued bringing weary travelers to their door. And in the orchard behind the cabin, the soil grew richer with each passing month. Colonel York returned on April 3rd with armed men. He'd learned that a woman had fled the inn after Elvira Bender threatened her with knives. But the younger Benders denied everything. Elvira, they claimed, couldn't even understand English. The colonel wasn't convinced, but he needed proof. He would get it, just not in time to save anyone. Because by the time the truth came to light, By the time the bodies were finally discovered, the Bender family had already vanished into the vastness of the American frontier. The year 1873 was bringing forces that would transform their obscure way station into one of the most infamous crime scenes in American history. The question that would haunt investigators for the next 150 years wasn't just what happened at the Bender Inn. It was what happened to the Benders themselves. But that discovery, that moment when the full horror would be revealed, was still weeks away. For now, in early April 1873, the Benders were still in their cabin, still greeting travelers with warm smiles, still hiding behind that canvas curtain with a hammer in hand. And Colonel York was running out of time to find his brother. Chapter 2. The Inn of Death, April 1873. The net was closing. Colonel York's suspicions had grown with each passing day. 2 visits to the Bender Inn hadn't given him proof, but his instincts screamed that something was wrong. At the Harmony Grove schoolhouse, 75 locals gathered to discuss the disappearances that plagued the Osage Mission Trail. Both Bender men attended the meeting. They listened as the community agreed to search every homestead between Big Hill Creek and Drum Creek. They sat quietly as search warrants were discussed. They showed no emotion when William York's name was mentioned. Then they went home. 3 days later, they were gone. Billy Toll was driving cattle past the Bender property when he noticed something wrong. The inn stood silent. No smoke rose from the chimney. The farm animals hadn't been fed. He reported it immediately to the township trustee. Bad weather delayed the investigation for several days. When volunteers finally assembled, hundreds turned out, including Colonel York. What they found at the Bender homestead would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The cabin was empty, stripped of food, clothing, and personal possessions. But something was wrong with the air. A sickening smell permeated everything. Then they found the trapdoor. It was nailed shut, hidden underneath one of the beds. The volunteers pried it open with crowbars. Beneath lay a cellar, 6 feet deep and 7 feet square. The floor was covered in clotted blood, not splattered, not sprayed, pooled. The stench that rose from that opening was so powerful, it nearly drove the men from the cabin. These were frontier men accustomed to butchering livestock, to the harsh realities of prairie life. But this was different. This was human blood. Leroy Dick was among the searchers. He grabbed a sledgehammer and began breaking up the stone slab floor, convinced bodies were hidden underneath. The hammer blows echoed through the empty cabin as chunks of limestone shattered and flew. Sweat poured down faces. Hands bled from the work. Nothing. No bodies in the cellar, but the blood told them everything they needed to know. The soil beneath the stones was saturated with it, soaked through from countless victims whose throats had been cut in that underground chamber. The blood had nowhere to go but down, seeping into the earth, creating a grotesque record of death. The searchers made a decision. They would move the entire cabin. Think about that for a moment. These men were so determined to find the truth that they physically lifted a building and relocated it. Using ropes, poles, and sheer manpower, they dragged the structure aside. Then they began digging. Still no bodies. Colonel York stood in the orchard, watching the excavation. His brother was out there somewhere. He could feel it. The afternoon sun beat down on the searchers as they probed the ground with metal rods, especially in the disturbed soil of the vegetable garden. One rod struck something soft. They began to dig. Shovels bit into the earth. The crowd grew quiet. Then someone gasped. A hand. They dug faster now, carefully exposing the body. A man, buried face down, his feet barely below the surface. His skull was crushed at the base. His throat had been cut so deeply it nearly severed his head. Edward York, the colonel's other brother, pushed forward through the crowd. He looked at the body. His face went white. "William," he whispered. Dr. William Henry York had been found. The man who had come searching for his missing friends was now lying in a shallow grave, murdered by the very people he had questioned. But he wasn't alone. Over the next 3 days, the orchard gave up its dead. Each probe of the metal rod revealed another grave. Each grave revealed another horror. The bodies were placed in wooden coffins and laid beside their graves for identification. Leroy Dick identified his cousin, Henry Mackenzie. The man had a crushed skull and a slit throat. William Cotty was identified by a tattoo on his forearm, listing his name, date of birth, and Civil War regiment. He had survived the bloodiest conflict in American history, only to die at a table in Kansas. Then they found George Launcher, the man who had left Independence with his 8-year-old daughter, heading to Iowa to start a new life. His skull was crushed, and beside him was Mary Ann. The little girl's body told a story that made even hardened men weep. Her skull was intact, no hammer blow, but her arm was broken. A scarf was tied tightly around her neck. She had been alive when they put her in the ground, buried alive with her dead father, suffocating in the dark earth, while the Benders returned to their cabin to clean up and prepare for the next victim. Had she screamed? Had they heard her muffled cries from underground and simply ignored them? By the time the excavation ended, 8 bodies had been recovered from the orchard. But the disturbed soil suggested more. The death toll was estimated at 11 confirmed victims, possibly as many as 20. Most of the bodies were never claimed and were reburied at the bottom of a hill roughly 1 mile from the Bender home. This area is now known as the Bender Mounds. Back at the cabin, investigators continued their search. 3 hammers were recovered: a shoe hammer, a claw hammer, a sledgehammer. Each one matched the wounds on the victims' skulls. A knife was found, hidden inside a mantel clock, its blade stained dark. The canvas curtain that had divided the cabin was examined more closely. It was stained with blood splatter on the side facing the private quarters. The pattern told the story. Victims sitting at the table, backs to the curtain, unaware that death was inches away. News of the discoveries spread like wildfire. Within days, nearly 3,000 people descended on the Bender property. They came from neighboring counties, from distant towns, drawn by morbid curiosity and the need to witness the scene of such unprecedented horror. Photographers chronicled the gruesome spectacle. Newspapers across the United States, England, and France followed the unfolding drama. The Bender case became a sensation. But where were the Benders? Investigators pieced together their escape. The old man had sold his mules, a watch, and clothing at various locations before the family fled. At Thayer, someone matching John Bender Sr.'s description had purchased tickets to Humboldt, a distant town. But was that really where they went? The family had stolen approximately $4,585 from their victims, along with a saddle, wagon, team of horses, and a pony. With that much cash and transportation, they could have gone anywhere. They had days, possibly weeks, of head start before anyone realized what had happened. Colonel York organized search parties. Rewards were posted. Descriptions of the Benders were telegraphed to every sheriff and marshal in the surrounding states. Enormous bounties were offered for information leading to their capture. Nothing. The prairie had swallowed them whole. As spring turned to summer in 1873, the abandoned Bender homestead stood as a monument to evil. The cabin, moved aside during the excavation, was left where it stood. The orchard, its soil rich with the blood and bones of innocents, would never bear fruit again. The vegetable garden, where Kate had grown tomatoes and potatoes, was now a graveyard. Locals began calling it Hell's Half Acre. Parents used it as a warning to frighten children into good behavior. Behave, or the Benders will get you. But the Benders were gone, and despite the massive manhunt, despite the rewards, despite countless reported sightings and arrests of lookalikes, they were never definitively found. The family that had turned hospitality into murder, that had welcomed weary travelers only to crush their skulls and rob their corpses, had simply vanished. They left behind only questions, bodies, and nightmares. One question haunted Colonel York as he stood in that blood-soaked orchard. When he had sat at their table on March 28th, eating their food, asking about his brother, William had already been dead for 19 days, buried not 50 yards from where the colonel sat. The Benders had served him dinner while his brother's corpse rotted in their garden. Kate had smiled at him. The old man had nodded sympathetically. John Jr. had suggested Indians might be responsible. And all the while they knew exactly where William York was. They had put him there. As investigators continued processing the scene, a disturbing realization emerged. The efficiency of the operation, the practiced nature of the killings, the systematic disposal of bodies. This wasn't the work of amateurs. The Benders had refined their method over time, which meant their first victims might not be in that orchard. The family had arrived in 1870. They had claimed their land, built their cabin, and opened their inn. How long had it taken them to commit their first murder? And had there been others, buried elsewhere, that were never found? The investigation would continue for months, then years. Tip after tip would lead nowhere. Women claiming to be Kate Bender would be arrested and proven to be imposters. Men matching John Bender's description would be extradited to Kansas, only to be released when they couldn't be positively identified. The Benders had become ghosts, but their legacy remained, carved into the earth of that Kansas prairie, written in blood in that underground cellar, marked by the 8 graves that had been dug up in their orchard. The question everyone asked was simple. How? How had 4 people murdered at least 11 victims, possibly twice that many, without anyone noticing? How had they operated for nearly 3 years before being discovered? And how, in the end, had they simply disappeared? The answer lay in the very nature of the frontier itself. The isolation that made Kansas attractive to homesteaders also made it perfect for predators. The vastness that promised freedom also provided endless places to hide. The culture that valued privacy and asked few questions about a person's past created an environment where monsters could flourish. The Bender family had understood this perfectly. They had weaponized hospitality, turned sanctuary into slaughter. And when their crimes were finally discovered, that same frontier wilderness provided their escape route. But somewhere out there, beyond the Kansas border, in another town or territory, were 4 people who had gotten away with serial murder. 4 people who knew how to kill efficiently and dispose of bodies expertly. 4 people who had tasted blood and profit. The question wasn't just where they had gone. It was whether they had stopped. Chapter 3. The Vanishing. The reward was unprecedented. Governor Thomas Osborne posted $2,000 for information leading to the Benders' capture. The families of victims added more. By June 1873, the total bounty reached $3,000, equivalent to over $70,000 in today's currency. It was one of the largest rewards in American frontier history. No one ever claimed it. Within hours of discovering the bodies, posses formed across Kansas. Armed men on horseback fanned out in every direction, questioning travelers, searching homesteads, checking train stations. Telegraph wires hummed with descriptions of the fugitives. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco published their portraits. The Benders had vanished into thin air. Investigators pieced together their escape route. On April 9, 1873, neighbors reported seeing the Bender wagon heading toward Independence. The old man had sold his mules and horses in nearby Thayer. Someone matching John Sr.'s description purchased train tickets to Humboldt. Then the trail went cold. Captain James B. Ransom, conductor on the Leavenworth, Lawrence and Galveston Railroad, came forward weeks later with crucial information. He remembered 2 passengers matching John Jr. and Kate's description. They had boarded his train and disembarked at Chanute, then transferred to the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad, heading south. Their destination? The Red River Country, near Denison, Texas. Meanwhile, witnesses reported seeing an older couple fitting Ma and Pa Bender's description traveling north to Kansas City. From there, they allegedly boarded a train to St. Louis. If these accounts were accurate, the family had split up immediately after fleeing. It was a smart strategy. 4 people traveling together would attract attention, but 2 couples heading in opposite directions? Much harder to track. Colonel Alexander York refused to give up. He stood before the Kansas legislature in May 1873, his voice shaking with rage and grief. "These fiends have made a mockery of frontier hospitality and stained the good name of our state with innocent blood," he declared. "I pledge my fortune and my honor to seeing them brought to justice." He hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency. The Pinkertons were the best in the business, a private detective force that had protected President Lincoln and hunted down train robbers and outlaws across the West. They assigned 5 agents to the Bender case, an unprecedented allocation of resources. Wanted posters were distributed throughout the Western territories. The descriptions were detailed, specific, designed to help even strangers identify the fugitives. The posters survive in historical archives to this day. Within months, the sightings began. A woman resembling Kate was spotted in Texas, then in New Mexico, then in Colorado. An older couple matching Ma and Pa Bender's description was seen in Missouri, then Illinois, then Michigan. Every lead was investigated, every sighting checked. Detectives traveled thousands of miles chasing ghosts. In 1874, a woman claiming to be Kate Bender was arrested in Montana. She was brought back to Kansas in chains, paraded before witnesses who had known the real Kate. They stared at her face, studied her features, listened to her voice. It wasn't her. The woman was released. The search continued. But not everyone waited for the law. Vigilante justice was common on the frontier, where courts were distant and legal processes slow. Some Kansas residents believed the Benders deserved something more immediate than a trial. Rumors began circulating almost immediately after the discovery of the bodies. One group of vigilantes claimed they had caught up with the Benders 3 days after their escape. According to their account, they cornered the family at a remote campsite. The men and Ma Bender were shot dead. Kate, they said, was burned alive as the witch they believed her to be. Another group told a different story. They claimed to have intercepted the Benders near the Verdigris River as they attempted to flee south. A gunfight ensued. All 4 Benders were killed and their bodies thrown into the river. A third group insisted they had tracked the family to the Oklahoma border. There, they said, frontier justice was delivered swiftly. The Benders were lynched from a cottonwood tree and buried in unmarked graves on the prairie. Each group claimed victory. Each group claimed to have ended the Benders' reign of terror. But none could produce proof. No bodies were ever recovered. No physical evidence was ever presented. Were these stories true? Or were they fantasies? Tales told by men who wanted credit for something they hadn't done? The mystery deepened in 1889. 2 women were arrested in a small Michigan town, Mrs. Elvira Hill and her daughter, Mrs. Sarah Davis. An anonymous tip claimed they were actually Ma and Kate Bender. The women were extradited to Kansas and jailed in Oswego. A 13-member identification panel was assembled. 7 members confirmed the identification. These were people who had known the Benders, who had seen them, spoken with them, done business with them. They looked at these 2 women and swore they were the infamous murderers. The case seemed solid. After 16 years, the Benders had finally been caught. But Mrs. Hill had an alibi. Her daughter, Mary Garday, provided an affidavit stating that her mother, under the name Almira Marks, had been serving 2 years in the Detroit House of Corrections in 1872 for manslaughter. The dates overlapped with several of the Bender murders. Incarceration records backed up the claim. The defense attorney also produced a marriage certificate showing that Sarah Davis had been married in Michigan in 1872. Again, during the time when murders were being committed in Kansas. At her hearing, Mrs. Hill initially denied any knowledge of the name Shearer or the manslaughter conviction. She didn't want the court to know about her criminal past. But when pressed, she admitted the truth. Yes, she had been in prison in Michigan. No, she could not have been in Kansas murdering travelers. Eyewitness testimony contradicted the alibi. People swore Mrs. Hill was Elvira Bender. They were certain. They had seen her at the inn. The trial was originally scheduled for February 1890, then delayed to May. During those months, more evidence emerged. More affidavits supporting the women's claims. More inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. There was another problem: language. The older woman spoke fluent English with no accent. Ma Bender had struggled to speak English at all. Every witness from Kansas remembered her limited vocabulary, her heavy German accent. Judge Calvin reviewed the evidence. The affidavits were compelling, though he dismissed some as unreliable. The defense attorney openly admitted his clients were criminals and liars. But the charges, he argued, were weak. The judge agreed. The women were discharged. Were they really innocent? Or had they simply outsmarted the prosecution? The affidavits and other papers mysteriously disappeared from the Labette County files. Further examination became impossible. Researchers have questioned the ready acceptance of the alibi's authenticity. Some suggest the county was simply unwilling to pay the expense of boarding 2 women for an extended trial. The truth died with those who knew it. As the 19th century ended, Hope of finding the Benders faded. The Pinkerton agents moved on to other cases. The rewards were never claimed. Colonel York died in 1905, never knowing what happened to his brother's killers. The theories multiplied. Some believed the vigilante stories were true, that the Benders had been killed shortly after their escape. It would explain why they were never found, why the trail went completely cold. Frontier justice had a way of dispensing with legal niceties. Others insisted the family had successfully escaped. Texas was wild and lawless in 1873, full of outlaw colonies where fugitives could disappear. The Red River country, where John Jr. and Kate allegedly fled, was known as a haven for criminals. No one asked questions there. No one cared about your past. A third theory suggested they had changed their identities completely. The $4,585 they stole from victims, plus their other ill-gotten gains, would have been enough to start over somewhere new. New names? New lives? Perhaps they even split up permanently, each going their separate way. There was one more theory, darker than the others. What if they hadn't stopped? The Benders had operated for nearly 3 years without detection. They had refined their method, perfected their system. They knew how to lure victims, how to kill efficiently, how to dispose of bodies. They had proven they could hide in plain sight, presenting themselves as respectable homesteaders while committing atrocities. What if they simply set up shop somewhere else? The American frontier in 1873 was vast. Millions of square miles of territory where people came and went, where disappearances were common, where isolated homesteads dotted the landscape. If the Benders had established another inn along another lonely trail, who would have known? In the years following their escape, unsolved disappearances were reported along various frontier routes. Travelers who never reached their destinations. Bodies found in shallow graves with crushed skulls and slit throats, patterns that echoed the Kansas murders. Were these the work of the Benders? Or were they simply the ordinary dangers of frontier life? There was no way to know. Back in Kansas, the Bender property became infamous. The cabin was eventually burned down by outraged locals who couldn't bear to see it standing. The orchard was left to grow wild. The graves were filled in, though the ground remained disturbed for years. People avoided the site. They said it was cursed, that the spirits of the victims still walked the property at night. Parents used it to frighten children into obedience. Behave, or the Benders will get you. But the Benders were gone. And despite the largest manhunt in frontier history, despite the unprecedented rewards, despite the Pinkerton detectives and the vigilante posses and the countless investigations, they were never found. The question haunted everyone who studied the case. How? How did 4 people, not particularly educated or sophisticated, evade capture so completely? How did they disappear without leaving a single confirmed trace? And if they were killed by vigilantes, why did no one ever come forward with proof? Perhaps the answer lay in the very nature of the American frontier. The vastness that made it attractive also made it impossible to police. The freedom that drew settlers westward also protected those who wanted to escape justice. The culture that valued privacy and asked few questions created an environment where people could simply vanish. The Benders understood this. They had used it to their advantage while committing their crimes. And in the end, they used it to disappear. 150 years have passed since that April day when the bodies were discovered in the orchard. Generations of investigators, historians, and amateur sleuths have tried to solve the mystery. Books have been written, documentaries produced, theories debated. But the truth remains elusive. Were the Benders killed by vigilantes in the days following their escape? Did they successfully flee to Texas or beyond, living out their lives under assumed names? Or did they establish another murder inn somewhere on the frontier, continuing their bloody work until age or circumstance finally stopped them? We will never know. What we do know is this: 4 people committed at least 11 murders, possibly 20, in the heart of America. They preyed on the innocent, weaponized hospitality and turned a family home into an abattoir. And when their crimes were discovered, they simply walked away into history. The Bloody Benders remain one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. Not just what they did, though, that was horrific enough, but what happened to them after. The Kansas prairie keeps its secrets, and some secrets, it seems, are buried too deep to ever be uncovered. Chapter 4. The Witch of Kansas. Julia Hessler arrived at the Bender cabin on a cold morning in December 1872. She had come for a seance. Kate Bender had promised to contact Julia's dead husband. For weeks, Kate had visited the grieving widow, offering comfort and assurances that she could bridge the gap between life and death. Julia had resisted at first, but Kate was persistent, charming, convincing. Finally, Julia agreed. When she stepped through the doorway that December morning, a powerful stench hit her like a physical blow. It was the smell of rot, of decay, of something fundamentally wrong. Julia's instincts screamed at her to leave. Kate smiled warmly and invited her to sit. Julia sat at the table, her back to the canvas curtain. Kate began her ritual, speaking in low tones, calling to the spirits beyond. But Julia couldn't concentrate. The smell was overwhelming. And there was something else. A feeling of being watched, of danger pressing close. She stood abruptly and made an excuse to leave. Kate's smile never wavered, but something flickered in her eyes. Disappointment? Anger? Julia Hessler walked out of that cabin and never returned. She would later realize she had been sitting exactly where Dr. William York had sat, where George Launcher had sat, where at least 11 other victims had sat before a hammer crushed their skulls. The smell she had detected was death. The cellar beneath her feet had been full of it. Julia Hessler was one of the lucky ones. But who was Kate Bender? How did a young woman become the face of one of America's most notorious serial killer families? And was spiritualism just a cover for murder, or something more sinister? The advertisement appeared in newspapers throughout Labette County in 1872. Professor Miss Katie Bender can heal all sorts of diseases, can cure blindness, fits, deafness, and all such diseases. Also deaf and dumbness. Residence, 14 miles east of Independence, on the road from Independence to Osage Mission 1 and 1/2 miles southeast of Norahhead Station. Katie Bender. Professor. She called herself Professor. A woman on the Kansas frontier in 1872, claiming academic authority in an era when most women couldn't attend university. It was audacious, bold, designed to attract attention, and it worked. Kate traveled throughout the region giving lectures on spiritualism and psychic phenomena. She spoke at churches, community halls, private homes. She was articulate, confident, charismatic. People listened. Spiritualism was sweeping America in the 1870s. The Civil War had created an entire generation of grieving families desperate to contact their dead. Widows wanted to speak to husbands, mothers wanted to hear from sons. The movement offered hope, comfort, connection to those who had been lost. It also offered opportunities for manipulation. Kate Bender understood this perfectly. She claimed to possess second sight, the ability to see the future, to communicate with spirits, to heal with herbs and charms. She held seances in the family cabin, contacting the dead for grieving clients. How many of those clients walked out alive? The case of John D. Jr. reveals Kate's predatory instincts. In 1872, Dee died in a prairie fire, leaving behind a young widow. Kate latched onto the family immediately. She visited the widow repeatedly, insisting she could contact John's spirit, badgering her to come to the cabin for a seance. The widow refused. Kate persisted, showing up at the family's property uninvited. Finally, John Dee's mother ran Kate off, telling her to leave the family alone. Kate never contacted the dead John Dee. But one has to wonder, if the widow had agreed, if she had gone alone to that cabin and sat at that table with her back to the canvas curtain, would she have joined her husband in death? Ma Bender also claimed to be a medium, though not as skilled as her daughter. Neighbors described Ma as a large woman in her early 50s with a fierce temper. She kept her husband and son in line with an iron will. But she never seemed angry at Kate. Kate was special. Kate was useful. The spiritualist community in Labette County had no idea what was happening at the Bender Inn. The family attended church services regularly. They socialized with neighbors. Kate gave her lectures and performed her healings. They appeared to be devout believers in the spiritualist movement. They weren't. Spiritualism was a hunting tool. It brought vulnerable people to their door, people who were grieving, distracted, emotionally raw, people who wouldn't notice small details, who wouldn't question strange smells or odd behavior, people who were so desperate to contact their dead that they walked willingly into danger. Kate was the perfect lure. Young, attractive, well-spoken, she put travelers at ease, made them feel welcome, engaged them in pleasant conversation while her family prepared for murder. But there was something else about Kate, something that went beyond calculated manipulation. Multiple witnesses who survived encounters with her described an unsettling quality, a coldness behind her charm, an intensity in her eyes that made them uncomfortable. Frances McCann was 12 years old when she met Kate Bender. Years later, she recalled the encounter with vivid clarity. Kate had stared at her with an expression that made the girl's blood run cold. "She looked at me," Frances said, "like she was measuring me for a grave." The girl's mother hurried them away. Kate's background remains mostly unknown. Where did she come from? Who were the Benders before they arrived in Kansas? The questions have no definitive answers. The surname Bender is German in origin, connected to the occupation of Cooper, a barrel maker. German immigrants flooded into America throughout the mid-1800s, fleeing economic hardship and political unrest. Many settled in the Midwest, including Kansas. But were the Benders actually German? Old Man Bender spoke with a thick German accent and limited English. Ma Bender claimed to speak almost no English at all. Yet Kate was fluent, articulate, capable of giving public lectures. The inconsistency troubled investigators. If Kate was the daughter of German immigrants who struggled with English, How did she become so well-spoken? Where did she receive her education? Some theorized that Kate wasn't related to the older Benders at all, that she had joined the family later, bringing her charm and intelligence to their enterprise. Others suggested she might have been educated in a convent or boarding school, unusual for the time, but not impossible. The truth died with her. What we know is this. By 1872, Kate Bender had established herself as a prominent spiritualist in southeastern Kansas. People traveled significant distances to attend her seances and lectures. She had a following, a reputation, legitimacy. She used it to kill. The spiritualist movement itself became tainted by the Bender case. When news of the murders broke in May 1873, newspapers across the country drew connections between Kate's spiritualism and her crimes. The Witch of Kansas, they called her, the beautiful fiend, the spiritualist killer. Harry Houdini, the famous magician who dedicated his later life to exposing fake spiritualists, cited the Bender case as evidence of the movement's corruption. Spiritualism, he declared, is the most monstrous fiction, capitalizing on grieving people's vulnerability. The Bender case proved his point. But was Kate a true believer or a cynical manipulator? Did she actually think she could communicate with the dead? Or was it all an elaborate con? The answer might be more disturbing than either option. Consider the psychological profile. Kate held seances in a cabin where she had murdered multiple people. She claimed to contact the dead while bodies rotted in the cellar beneath her feet. She performed healings in a space saturated with violence and death. That's not ordinary criminal behavior. That's pathological. Some modern psychologists who have studied the case suggest Kate might have genuinely believed in her spiritual powers. That in her mind, the murders and the spiritualism were connected. A way of sending souls to the other side that she could then contact. A twisted logic that made sense only to her. Others argue she was a classic psychopath. Charming, manipulative, utterly without empathy. The spiritualism was simply her preferred method of control, a tool she wielded with deadly effectiveness. We'll never know. What we do know is that Kate Bender terrified people. Even those who survived encounters with her remembered the fear, the sense that something was fundamentally wrong with this beautiful young woman who smiled so warmly while discussing death. After the murders were discovered, one detail haunted investigators more than any other. Among the victims' possessions found in the cabin were several items belonging to women and children, not adult men, who made up most of the identified bodies. Women and children. Where were their bodies? The orchard was excavated thoroughly. Every inch of disturbed soil was examined. 8 bodies were recovered, possibly more that had decomposed beyond recognition. But the possessions suggested additional victims who were never found. Had Kate lured women to seances, then murdered them? Had families with children stopped at the inn? What happened to them? The missing bodies remain one of the case's greatest mysteries, but they add another dimension to Kate's story. She wasn't just the front woman for her family's crimes. She was an active, enthusiastic participant. She enjoyed it. When Colonel York visited the Bender cabin on March 28, 1873, Kate was charming and helpful. She offered to use her spiritualist abilities to help locate his missing brother. But she claimed to be in the wrong mood and suggested he return alone later. Return alone. The colonel, a seasoned Civil War veteran and attorney, recognized the danger. He didn't return alone. he came back with 50 armed men. By then, the Benders were gone. Kate's final victims will never be known. How many people sat across from her at that table, listening to her pleasant conversation, feeling safe in her presence? How many never realized that behind the canvas curtain, someone was raising a hammer? The spiritualist movement in Kansas collapsed after the Bender revelations. People who had attended Kate's lectures felt violated, betrayed. Churches that had hosted her felt complicit. The entire community was traumatized. She seemed so normal, one witness said. So kind. How could someone like that commit such horrors? It's the question that haunts every serial killer case. The monster doesn't look like a monster. Evil wears a pleasant face. Kate Bender wore it better than most. When she disappeared in April 1873, she became legend. The Witch of Kansas lived on in newspapers, dime novels, campfire stories. She was romanticized, demonized, transformed into something larger than life. But the real Kate Bender was worse than any legend. She was a young woman who used her intelligence, charm, and spiritual beliefs to lure innocent people to their deaths. She was a predator who understood human vulnerability and exploited it ruthlessly. And somewhere out there, after April 1873, she simply vanished. Did she continue practicing spiritualism under a different name? Did she establish another seance business in another town, attracting another group of unsuspecting victims? Or did she finally become the thing she had pretended to be? A spirit herself, claimed by the darkness she had served. The prairie wind still blows across the land where the Bender cabin once stood. Local legend says that on certain nights, you can see a woman's figure standing in the old orchard. A young woman with dark hair, watching the road, watching for travelers. Some call it the ghost of Kate Bender. Still hunting. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. The telegram arrived at 3:47 p.m. on May 8, 1873. Bodies found, 8 confirmed, Benders fled, send men. Within an hour, horses were saddled across 3 counties. By nightfall, over 200 armed men had converged on Cherry Vale. They weren't lawmen. They were fathers, brothers, husbands, men who had lost someone on the Osage Mission Trail, men who wanted answers, men who wanted blood. Brockman knew they were coming for him. He was a German immigrant, a friend, and former business partner of Old Man Bender. He had done nothing wrong. He knew nothing about the murders. But on the night of May 8, 1873, innocence meant nothing. The mob arrived at midnight. 20 men, maybe 30, faces hidden by darkness and fury. They dragged Brockman from his bed, his wife screaming, his children crying. Where are they? Brockman swore he didn't know. They threw a rope over the barn beam. The noose went around his neck. They pulled. Brockman kicked and gasped, his face turning purple, his eyes bulging. Just before he lost consciousness, they lowered him down. Where are the Benders? I don't know, he choked out. I swear to God, I don't know. They hanged him again. This time they held him longer, until his body went limp, until urine soaked his pants, until death was seconds away. They lowered him, revived him, asked the same question. He gave the same answer. They hanged him a 3rd time. When they finally cut him down and left, Brockman lay in the dirt outside his barn, barely breathing, as one who was drunken or deranged. His wife found him at dawn. He survived, but he never fully recovered. That was how the reckoning began. Across Labette County, anyone with German heritage, anyone who had spoken to the Benders, anyone remotely connected to the family, became a target. Mobs formed spontaneously. Houses were searched. People were interrogated at gunpoint. The law tried to maintain order. Sheriff Dick tried to calm the crowds. But the prairie had its own justice, and after what had been found in that orchard, no one was interested in courts or due process. 3,000 people descended on the Bender property in the days following the discovery. They came from Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma Territory. Reporters arrived from New York, Chicago, Philadelphia. Photographers set up their equipment, documenting the scene. The cabin became a pilgrimage site. But the pilgrims were locusts. They stripped the cabin piece by piece, took the bloody canvas curtain as a souvenir, pried up the floorboards stained with victims' blood, removed the bricks that lined the cellar, each one soaked in death. They dug up stones from the well, tore out window frames, carried away chairs, tables, anything touched by the murderers. Within a week, the cabin was gone. Not demolished, disassembled. Scattered across Kansas in private collections, ghoulish trophies of America's first serial killer family. The orchard was worse. People dug everywhere, convinced more bodies lay hidden. They probed the ground with metal rods, excavated random patches of earth, turned the soil into a moonscape of holes and trenches. Some were genuine searchers, looking for missing loved ones. Others were macabre tourists, hoping to find a skull or bone to take home. The 8 identified bodies were eventually removed for proper burial. Most were never claimed. They were reinterred at the bottom of a hill, roughly 1 mile from the Bender property. The site became known as the Bender Mounds. But questions remained. Those disturbed patches of soil in the orchard suggested more graves. The possessions found in the cabin belonged to people whose bodies were never recovered. How many had the Benders really killed? The official count stood at 11 confirmed victims. Some investigators believed it was 20 or more. The truth was buried somewhere in that blood-soaked Kansas soil. Meanwhile, inside what remained of the cabin, investigators made a chilling discovery: a Roman Catholic prayer book. Inside, notes written in German. When translated, they read, "Johanna Bender, born July 30th, 1848. Another note, John Gebhardt came to America on July 1st, 18. The most disturbing entry was in an old Bible, also found in the house. Big Slaughter Day, Jan 8th. Hell departed. What happened on January 8th? How many people died that day? And what did hell departed mean? That the victims had gone to hell, or that hell itself had left, implying the Benders were hell on earth? The notes raised more questions than they answered. If Johanna Bender was born in 1848, she would have been only 25 in 1873. Was this Kate's real name? And who was John Gebhardt? Was Old Man Bender using a false name? The Bender family's true identities remained a mystery. But those Bible entries suggested they had been planning, recording, perhaps even celebrating their crimes. As spring turned to summer in 1873, the manhunt intensified. Governor Osborne's $2,000 reward drew bounty hunters from across the country. Pinkerton detectives followed leads from Texas to Canada. Colonel York personally financed search parties, spending his entire fortune hunting his brother's killers. But the Benders had vanished. Then the rumors began. A group of men from Cherryvale claimed they had caught the Benders 3 days after the bodies were discovered. According to their story, they had tracked the family to a camp near the Kansas-Oklahoma border. When confronted, John Jr. had drawn a gun. The vigilantes opened fire. All 4 Benders were killed, they said. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves on the prairie. No one would ever find them. Another group told a different tale. They claimed to have intercepted the Benders at the Verdigris River. A shootout ensued. The Benders were killed and their bodies thrown into the river, weighted with stones. A third story emerged from a saloon in Independence. A drunken man boasted that he had been part of a vigilante group that caught the Benders attempting to board a train in Missouri. They were taken to an abandoned farmhouse. What happened there, the man said, was too terrible to describe. But justice had been served. Each story ended the same way. The Benders were dead. Frontier justice had been delivered. Case closed. But none of the storytellers could produce proof. No bodies were ever recovered. No physical evidence was ever presented. And strangely, multiple groups claimed credit for the same deed. Were these stories true? Or were they lies told by men who wanted to be heroes? Some historians believe the vigilante tales were fabricated to prevent panic. If people thought the Benders were still alive, still out there somewhere, fear would spread. But if everyone believed they were dead, killed by frontier justice, the community could find peace. Others argue that at least one of the stories might be true. The Benders had humiliated Kansas, made a mockery of frontier hospitality, murdered innocent people for profit. If vigilantes had caught them, they wouldn't have waited for a trial. They would have delivered immediate justice. And they would have kept it secret to avoid prosecution. The truth died somewhere on the Kansas prairie in 1873. But the legacy of the Benders lived on. The property where their cabin stood became cursed ground. No one would buy it. No one would farm it. No one would even walk across it after dark. Locals reported seeing strange lights in the old orchard, hearing screams on the wind, seeing figures moving through the grass where the cabin had stood. The Bender mounds, where the victims were reburied, became a pilgrimage site for the morbidly curious. People came to lay flowers, to say prayers, to stand in the presence of such concentrated tragedy. Some claimed the ground itself felt wrong, heavy with the weight of violent death. Children growing up in Labette County in the 1870s and 1880s were raised on Bender stories. Parents used them as cautionary tales. Behave, or the Benders will get you. Don't talk to strangers, or you'll end up in the Benders' orchard. The case changed Kansas, changed how people viewed strangers, how they offered hospitality, how they trusted their neighbors. The frontier had always been dangerous, but the dangers had been external. Weather, disease, wild animals, hostile encounters. The Benders proved that the greatest danger could be wearing a smile and serving you dinner. In the decades that followed, the story grew into legend. Books were written, plays performed, songs composed. The Bloody Benders became part of American folklore, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can hide behind ordinary faces. But underneath the legend were real people. Dr. William York, who went searching for his friends and never came home. George Launcher, trying to give his daughter a better life. Mary Ann Launcher, only 19 months old, buried alive beside her father. Benjamin Brown, identified by his silver wedding ring, leaving behind a wife and daughter. 11 confirmed victims, possibly 20. Each one had a name, a story, a family that loved them. Each one stopped at an inn on a lonely prairie road, seeking food and shelter. Each one trusted the wrong people, and paid for it with their lives. As the 19th century drew to a close, interest in the Bender case gradually faded. New crimes, new horrors, new sensations captured the public's attention. The Kansas prairie reclaimed the land where the cabin had stood. Grass grew over the disturbed soil of the orchard. But the questions remained. What happened to the Benders? Were they really killed by vigilantes, their bodies hidden forever on the prairie? Or did they escape, create new identities, perhaps even continue their bloody work elsewhere? And if they did survive, if they did establish another inn on another lonely road in another state, how many more victims were there that we'll never know about? The prairie keeps its secrets. The wind blows across the Kansas grasslands, whispering stories of a family that turned hospitality into horror. And somewhere, buried in unmarked graves or scattered across the frontier, the truth lies waiting. Still undiscovered. Still unavenged. Chapter 6. Ghosts of the Prairie. On February 15, 1984, a man in Montana named John Flickinger walked to the edge of Lake Michigan. He was 70 years old, give or take. No one knew him well. He kept to himself, spoke little, avoided questions about his past. But there was something about his eyes, a coldness that made people uncomfortable. He waded into the frigid water and didn't come back. When they found his body 3 days later, investigators discovered something strange. Hidden in his cabin were newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle with age. Every single one was about the Bender family. Was John Flickinger actually John Bender Jr.? Had he spent 41 years running from his crimes before finally ending it in the cold waters of Lake Michigan? We'll never know. That same year, 1884, an elderly man was arrested near Salmon, Idaho for murder. The victim had been killed by a hammer blow to the skull. The man spoke with a thick German accent. He matched Old Man Bender's description perfectly. A telegram was sent to Cherryvale requesting identification. Before anyone could arrive, the suspect did something desperate. He severed his own foot to escape his leg irons. The self-mutilation was so severe he bled to death before help arrived. By the time the deputy from Cherryvale reached Salmon, the body had decomposed beyond recognition. Positive identification was impossible, but the locals were convinced. They removed the man's skull and displayed it in a saloon. For 36 years, until Prohibition closed the bar in 1920, people could walk in and stare at what they believed was Pa Bender's skull. Then it disappeared. Was it really him? Did Old Man Bender spend 11 years on the run before being caught in Idaho? Did he choose death over capture, severing his own foot rather than face Kansas justice? We'll never know. But the stories never stopped. 1. Michigan. A woman named Elvira Hill and her daughter Sarah Davis were arrested. An anonymous tip claimed they were Ma and Kate Bender. The women were brought to Kansas in chains and presented to witnesses who had known the Benders. 2. 16 people examined them. 7 swore positively they were the Benders. 7 swore equally positively they were not. 2 couldn't decide. How could 7 people who had known the Benders be so certain? And how could 7 others be just as certain they were wrong? Mrs. Hill had an alibi. In 1872, under the name Elmira Marks, she had been serving time in the Detroit House of Corrections for manslaughter. Prison records confirmed it. While the Benders were murdering travelers in Kansas, Elvira Hill was locked in a Michigan prison. Unless the records were forged. Unless someone bribed officials to create a false alibi. Unless everything about Mrs. Hill's story was an elaborate lie constructed over 16 years. The defense attorney openly admitted his clients were criminals and liars. But were they murderers? The judge reviewed the evidence and made his decision. The women were released. The documents supporting Mrs. Hill's alibi mysteriously disappeared from the Labette County files. Further investigation became impossible. 7 witnesses went to their graves believing they had let Kate Bender walk free. The sightings continued for decades. Kate seen in Texas. Ma spotted in California. John Jr. working on a ranch in Montana. Old Man Bender begging on the streets of Chicago. Every lead investigated. Every suspect examined. Every claim debunked. Or were they? Consider this. Between 1873 and 1900, at least 40 people were arrested across America on suspicion of being one of the Benders. 40 people who looked enough like the killers, talked enough like them, acted suspicious enough to warrant arrest and extradition. How many of those 40 were actually innocent? And if even one was guilty, what does that mean? It means the Benders got away with it. Susan Janusis, author of Hell's Half Acre, spent years researching the case. Her conclusion? The family probably wasn't a family at all. Kate and Ma were likely mother and daughter. Kate and John Jr. were probably common law married, not siblings. Old Man Bender was probably one of Ma's many previous husbands. They presented themselves as a family unit because it raised fewer questions. Think about what that means. These weren't blood relatives bound by some twisted family loyalty. They were 4 criminals who found each other, recognized something dark in each other, and decided to work together. A murder cooperative, which makes their escape even more likely. Family members might stick together, but business partners? Criminals united only by profit and shared guilt? They probably split up the moment they left Kansas, divided the stolen money, went their separate ways, created new identities. Somewhere in late 1870s America, 4 people were living quiet lives, working ordinary jobs, maybe even attending church on Sundays. And every single one of them had crushed skulls with hammers, had slit throats in a blood-soaked cellar, had buried bodies in an orchard while the Kansas wind whispered overhead. They knew what they had done. They carried it with them every day. And they never told a soul. Unless they did. 1. A woman on her deathbed in San Francisco made a confession to a Catholic priest. She claimed to have been Kate Bender. She described details of the murders that had never been published. She spoke of the victims' faces, their final words, the exact location of bodies that were never found. 2. The priest honored his vow of confession and never revealed the woman's identity. But he told others about the confession, enough that it became part of the Bender legend. Was she really Kate? Or just another damaged soul looking for notoriety on her deathbed? 1. An elderly man in a nursing home in Texas began talking about his past. He told nurses he had once been part of a family that killed travelers for money. He described a cabin with a canvas curtain, a cellar beneath the floor, an orchard where bodies were buried. 2. No one believed him. He was 92 years old, clearly senile, mixing up reality and imagination. When he died 3 weeks later, his ravings were forgotten. But what if he wasn't senile? What if he was John Gebhardt, the man who called himself John Bender Jr., finally unburdening his soul before death? What if both deathbed confessions were true? It would mean Kate Bender died in San Francisco in 1910 at age 62. John Gebhardt died in Texas in 1942 at 92. Both lived full lives after escaping Kansas. Both took their secrets to the grave. And somewhere, Ma and Pa Bender did the same. Today, the land where the Bender cabin stood is empty prairie. The soil has been turned by plows, rained on, frozen, thawed, turned again. Nothing remains of the structure that housed such horror. But people still go there. They stand in the grass and try to imagine it. The cabin, the table, the canvas curtain, the moment when a hammer descended and another life ended. The Bender mounds, where the victims were reburied, still exist. A small cemetery on a Kansas hillside. Most graves are unmarked. Most victims were never claimed by family. They lie there still, waiting. Dr. William York, George Launcher, and his daughter Mary Ann, Benjamin Brown, Henry Mackenzie, William Cotty, with his Civil War tattoo, and others whose names were never recorded, whose families never knew what happened to them. They were murdered for a few dollars and some personal belongings. Killed because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, because they trusted the wrong people, because they stopped at an inn on a lonely prairie road. Their killers were never caught, never punished, never faced justice. The Bender family, whether they died in 1873 by vigilante justice or decades later in their beds, got away with it. That's the truth we have to accept. But here's another truth. They didn't really escape. Their names are cursed. For 150 years, Bender has been synonymous with evil. Their story has been told and retold, each generation adding new details, new theories, new horror. Kate wanted to be famous. She advertised herself as Professor Miss Katie Bender. She gave public lectures, held seances, made herself visible. She got her fame, just not the kind she wanted. And somewhere, in an unmarked grave or scattered ashes, she knows it. The Kansas prairie is quiet now. The Osage Mission Trail is gone, replaced by highways and towns. The isolation that made the Benders' crimes possible no longer exists. But on certain nights, when the wind blows just right, locals say you can still hear things. Screams, whispers, the sound of a hammer striking bone. And if you stand in the old orchard at twilight, some say you can see her. A young woman with dark hair, standing by the road, watching, waiting, still hunting for victims who will never come. The bloody Benders vanished 152 years ago. Their bodies were never found. Their fate remains unknown, but their crimes echo through time, a reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a smile, behind an offer of hospitality, behind the most ordinary of faces. They murdered at least 11 people, possibly 20. They robbed. They lied. They destroyed families. And then they disappeared into America, becoming ghosts long before they died. But they left something behind. A question that haunts us still. If 4 people could commit such horrors and simply walk away, how many others have done the same? How many monsters live among us, wearing pleasant masks, carrying terrible secrets? How many times has evil escaped justice? The prairie keeps its secrets. The wind blows. The grass grows. And somewhere beneath the Kansas soil, answers lie buried, waiting to be found, or waiting to stay hidden forever.